Hello, and welcome to Picture This, a podcast from the photo archives of the Albuquerque Museum. My name is Jill Hartke, and I'm the digital archivist here at the museum. Today we are looking at the impact of the New Deal on the city of Albuquerque. The photo archives has many photographs showing construction projects over the decades, but few decades spurred as much major public construction in Albuquerque as the 1930s, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies greatly influenced the city. Here's the story behind these New Deal era photographs. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression began, there were suddenly millions of people needing work. On top of the economy failing, there was a terrible drought, and windstorms blew dirt across the heartland, forcing many farmers to abandon their land and take to the road, joining the millions of people drifting around the country looking for work. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated in March 1933 and famously told the American people,
"The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
He quickly began work on what would become New Deal policies, from the repeal of prohibition to the restructuring of the banking system. Federal programs began to target areas of American life with wide-ranging effects. At the time of FDR's inauguration, the leadership of Albuquerque was in the hands of Clyde Tingley. Roosevelt and Tingley were friends, and when Tingley became governor of New Mexico in 1935, he spent much of his time persuading Roosevelt's administration to fund projects in New Mexico. He was remarkably successful. Federal money poured into the state, and Clyde Tingley made sure that his hometown of Albuquerque saw a large portion of that funding. The New Deal was actually a wide range of individual relief programs rolled into two large policies over the 1930s. Programs like the Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, Social Security Administration, Public Works Administration, National Youth Administration, and many more all served as funding opportunities for employing people around the country. In Albuquerque, men and women temporarily employed through these federal relief programs left a legacy among the many public spaces and landmarks they built. The Federal Roads Project doubled or tripled the construction of highways across the United States at a time when people were on the move. This project helped to pave U.S. Route 66, known lovingly as the Mother Road. For 11 months at a time, men worked 30 hours a week paving highways across the country. New Mexico actually fell behind its neighbors on this project, but a localized push on the state's highway commission managed to get the highway fully paved through the state in 1937, thereby setting the stage for the impact that Route 66 would have in New Mexico in the coming decades. The New Mexico State Fairgrounds was a Works Progress Administration project pushed for by Governor Tingley, helping to create a statewide public space for farm goods, commerce, and entertainment. The fairground was built between 1936 and 1938, and most of the buildings were made of adobe. Tingley was adamant that New Mexico would have a state fair in 1938, the first large fair in over 20 years. The racetrack, grandstand, and some of the livestock stalls were completed by October of 1938, providing a place for the larger shows and events. Those events that couldn't be held under a roof were put under canvas tents. Opening day was October 9th, 1938, and a large parade down Central Avenue helped to lead citizens to the fairgrounds, where Governor Tingley gave a speech to open the fair. The Public Works Administration and the Works Projects Administration were the main funding sources for public schools in Albuquerque. 12 public schools and many of the classroom buildings in Zimmerman Library at the University of New Mexico were built using those programs. Like most federal projects, the work relied on manpower rather than machinery. The more men employed on a site, the greater the relief to the economy. Most of the workers had very little formal education themselves, but by spending their time building schools, they created a legacy of a wider public educational system for future generations in the city. Another legacy of the New Deal was the opportunity for cities to build public parks and recreational facilities. While we think of the New Deal as being a catalyst for new construction, and it definitely was, it also allowed for the upgrading or expansion of facilities that had already been built. One of Clyde Tingley's personal projects was turning a garbage dump along the Rio Grande into a swimming beach. Conservancy Beach first opened in 1931, before the New Deal was created. But once the policy was announced, Clyde Tingley requested approval over 8 years for funding to expand and upgrade that facility. By the end of the 1930s, the swimming beach, now known as Tingley Beach, had a bathhouse, lifeguard towers, diving boards, and boating facilities for people to enjoy during the summer months. One of the most popular programs for the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which required that every state hire their own citizens from the relief rolls to fill the program. This caused a bit of a headache for New Mexico because there were fewer people living in the state than in many other states, and the CCC refused to hire women, further limiting the people available to be employed. The CCC had camps across the United States, bringing men to federal lands for road work, planting trees, building fire lookout towers, and more. From 1933 to 1940, Albuquerque hosted 8 CCC projects. On the crest of the Sandia Mountains, east of Albuquerque in the Cibola National Forest, is the Kiwanis Cabin, a landmark still hiked to today that was built by the men of the CCC. The men lived in barrack-style camps on public lands and often abandoned them when the project was completed. The abandoned camps provided an opportunity to use them for a lesser-known relief program, the She camps. Because the CCC refused to hire women, Eleanor Roosevelt and other leaders pushed for a similar program that would focus solely on employing women. In 1935, under the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, a residential camp program known as She camps was begun. States were again asked to fill available positions in the camps with local unemployed women. The program focused on home economics, vocational training, health education, and recreation, and most women came from rural backgrounds where they had limited educational experience. In 1935, a women's camp called Camp Capitan opened in an abandoned CCC camp in Lincoln National Forest. Women at this New Mexico camp learned skills like stenography and home economics, but they also were given courses in colcha embroidery, tin work, wool spinning, moccasin making, and curing and dyeing hides. They sewed state flags for every public school in the state. They put out a newspaper, and they used their tin work skills to make sconces and chandeliers for the visitor center at White Sands National Monument. Funding for the She camps formally ended in 1937, but Camp Capitan continued to run until 1940, providing training and employment to nearly 2,000 women in New Mexico, and serving as the second longest running She camp in the nation. Despite its effort to improve American life, the New Deal had its critics. When the New Deal was initially announced, labor unions were in favor, thinking that the projects would naturally keep their workers gainfully employed. When they saw unskilled labor being hired for jobs over union members, labor unions became loudly critical of many of the projects. The criticisms were amplified in 1934 when the federal prison industries began putting prisoners to work building highways or completing forestry work on public lands, further undercutting the available work for union members. By the late 1930s, the Albuquerque organized trades estimated that only about 10% of the work being done on federal projects in Albuquerque was being completed by local union members, the rest being completed with unskilled and prison labor. Other critics believed that the pace of the work was too slow. City dwellers felt they were living in war zones with all of the construction sites, and the low pay meant that even when local labor was hired, they weren't making the same amount of money that they could make on a private job. Many of these issues were actually built into the New Deal. It was created to be less competitive to the labor unions by serving as a mostly unskilled labor program, catering to the masses of unemployed, rather than trying to pull local skilled labor that might still be employed in private construction work. The pay was low to keep from competing with those private contractors, and the pace was slow because manpower, not machinery, was the goal. And finally, the New Deal, although remembered for its construction legacy, wasn't just an infrastructure program, but also a cultural program. Artists were employed to put finishing touches on buildings in the form of murals or public art pieces, and to document life during the Great Depression. Some of our most iconic imagery of the era are from artists employed in these New Deal programs. The New Deal had societal implications that reached beyond boosting the economies of cities across the nation. While Albuquerque benefited greatly from the New Deal's funding of buildings, roads, parks, and federal lands, the picture was not completely rosy. By executive order, discrimination was barred in the policies of the New Deal, and workers were paid the same amount regardless of race. Still, the hiring of workers was not done equally across racial divides. People of color and women faced more hurdles than their white male counterparts when it came to benefiting from the New Deal. And in New Mexico, this meant the New Deal was bound to fail many of its citizens. African Americans found it harder to be hired for New Deal projects across the board. The Public Works Administration specifically worked with the NAACP to install a quota system that required all Public Works Administration projects to hire a fair share of black workers for every project. But Albuquerque had only 3 projects funded through the Public Works Administration, offering few guaranteed jobs for local African Americans in the city. For Native Americans, the New Deal created a policy called the Indian Reorganization Act, allowing Native communities to organize their own governments, use federal funds to purchase lost tribal lands, and be given preferential treatment for Bureau of Indian Affairs jobs on reservations. It also established the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, which was tasked with marketing pottery and weavings by members of Native communities. Deep-seated distrust of the American government meant that the success of these policies varied widely. Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants found the New Deal particularly difficult. Mexican American farm workers ran into trouble with the government deporting them to Mexico to remove them from the federal relief rolls. While the number of new Mexicans deported to Mexico is unclear, Texas, Arizona, and California deported over 80,000 people to Mexico between 1929 and 1935, including children who were born in the United States. Roosevelt's New Deal set out to create an opportunity for Americans to rise from the ashes of the Great Depression with more vocational training, better banks, an upgraded highway system, health, education, and more. Cities like Albuquerque jumped on board to use the New Deal to boost infrastructure, especially roads and bridges, public schools, and recreational facilities. The projects funded by the New Deal became critically important in the following decade. First, when the war effort relied heavily on vocational training many had picked up during employment on those federal New Deal projects. And then after World War II, when a population boom engulfed Albuquerque and the buildings and roadways built by the New Deal became vital in the sudden expansion of the city. The images preserved in the Albuquerque Museum's photo archive help to tell this story and allow us to share it through an exhibition called We Built This City. Visitors can learn the story of the New Deal era, but also stories of men and women who shaped the city's construction both before and after the 1930s. They are unique biographers of the city, and they tell us much about where we live and what or who was here before us. Thank you for joining us for Picture This with the Albuquerque Museum. Please join us next time for the story behind another photograph in the museum's collection.